All right, so continuing with the same theory of cognitive development, we're looking at information processing theory, which is just another extension of the cognitive theory, looking into how the human brain uses experience to advance cognition. The information processing theory, if you guys remember, we said compares the human brain to that of a computer. So, using the concept of input that we put into a computer, the computer processes this information or that data that we put in using the programs, and then it analyzes and then it gives us an output. That output can be in the form of the result that comes out on your screen or a printout that you take. So this process is very similar to what happens when us human beings come in interaction with a sensation and send that information to the brain to be processed and then act based on that process. So, information processing theorists illustrate this process of information processing through two specific aspects, and that is affordances and memory. So they really look at those two specific aspects of human cognition or infant cognition and see why we pretty much are our brains are pretty much like computers. So let's look at affordances, and let's first define what affordances are. An affordance is basically an opportunity for you as a human being to perceive something and interpret it, but that is definitely bound by your past experiences. So let's take an example with this picture. This is a mom and her toddler trying to cross the street, and a city street is an affordance. It's an opportunity to perceive and interact. However, it's an affordance that is going to be received in the brain of a toddler different than it will be received in the brain of its mother. The reason is the mom is going to rely on past experience and higher level of cognition in order for her to understand that this is a possible dangerous place, and therefore we have to hold hands, we have to cross the street after we look both sides, and we wait for a signal or the light to turn red, and then we cross fast. So all of these things are things that the brain is processing due to experience and concept that that the brain has received and developed that perception of the situation of a street. However, in the brain of a toddler, the street poses an open space, and due to the limited cognitive ability of the child at that age, they may not perceive this as a dangerous place. They perceive it as an open area for me to run. So those different inputs that we are putting into the processor or the brain are coming based on our past experiences. And that's why information processing theory says that affordances are perceived differently based on our cognitive level or ability. So the way the child is going to give the output or the reaction is they might run, and the mom is going to be screaming. Why? Because she thinks that the child is not paying attention or is not cognizant of the danger. But in fact, the child is just acting normal. They're acting within their cognitive ability of not perceiving this as a dangerous place. So the best way to do this is to hold the child's hand and to talk to the child and make sure that you are not that he understands, because they're not going to understand yet, and that's why at certain ages the expectations have to be equivalent to the age level. You cannot expect a 2-year-old to understand that this is a dangerous place because you told them 110 times. You're going to have to hold their hand and anticipate that they will run because cognitively they're not there yet. All right, what do we know from research that tells us that the brain perceives different affordances based on experience? Well, we know from a research called the visual cliff that infants who were put on this apparatus that is basically kind of like a glass that gives the illusion of it's a checkered on one side, but then there's a drop that looks like you're going to fall on the other side. But it's actually a plexiglass that goes all the way through. So the baby is not going to crawl and fall, it's going to crawl on a clear surface. But a baby that has no experience, past experience with walking yet, or crawling yet, or falling yet, will not be as cautious or as scared to cross over. A baby who has perhaps took their first movements and maybe fell off a bed or dropped or has experience with what it means to perceive this as a drop or as a danger will hesitate in crossing. What does this tell us? It tells us that the infant's performance is dependent on past experience. And sometimes it's not just past experience, sometimes it's social referencing. They are going to look at the context that they're within. And the best social context to an infant is the parent. And as you will see in the video that I've attached, the infant is going to look for cues to see if this is a safe move or not based on the mother's facial expressions. The other specific aspect of infant cognition is memory. When we look at how infants look at their world and retain that memory of what they see, we see another example of that little computer in their head. Information processing theory shows that memory in young babies is present as young as even 3 months old. The fact that we might at one point thought that there is infant amnesia is not true, because just because the baby is unable to recall a memory because they did not have the language to put it in words doesn't mean that they couldn't retain a memory. They couldn't hold that memory. How do we know this? We know this from a very important experiment called the Roe v. Collier experiment, and that happened with a 3-month-old who would be put in a crib and have their foot tied to a mobile that is on top of their head, and every time they kicked with their foot, it initiated a movement in the mobile, and whenever the baby remembered this process, they continued that circular interaction. So when they were taken away from the crib, put back in the crib later on, and tied again, they automatically used the foot that was tied to trigger the interaction. Now, what happens is that after 2 weeks of retesting them, after giving them a 2-week break, and retesting them, they did random kicks. They did not intentionally use the foot that would trigger the interaction, which means that they forgot. But what happened is that the researchers would give them a kind of a reminder session, and then take them away and then bring them back into the bed to test them, and immediately they saw that they regained their memory, which meant that the infants needed some processing time in order to retrieve that memory, because memory is basically a process of input, retention, and retrieval. All right, so let's look at the two types of memory and how they develop differently in the brain. We have implicit and explicit memory. Implicit precedes explicit memory. Implicit memory is nonverbal, and it begins very early and continues to improve throughout the first couple of years. Explicit memory, however, is tied to language, and that's why it emerges later on. Of course, babies are nonverbal until probably the first words is around the first year. But what we see is that sensory and caregiver memories, these are things that the babies remember the most, are apparent in the first month of life, and that's why they would remember a face, a familiar face. They start to distinguish between a familiar face and a a non-familiar face. Around 3 months, you will start to increase that memory to motor memory. So they would remember how to, like we said, kick to get that mobile to go around, or touch that toy so that it makes the noise. And then at about 9 months is where complex memories are going to start to emerge, because now we're starting to have a little bit more language. Of course, first words are going to be uttered at one, but the babbling and the sounds are going to take better formation, and we're going to see an improvement in recalling of memories, just like we saw with deferred imitation. So this is why we say that you might remember an incident, and that's your implicit memory, but you wouldn't remember what happened unless you have kind of processed it into an area in your brain with language. So it turned the implicit memory into an explicit memory.